There were few worse places on earth to build a town, but Nome had gone up almost overnight after 2 Swedes and a Norwegian found a nugget the size of a small rock in a creek near the beach. The men became known as the 3 Lucky Swedes, and their discovery in 1898 would set off a stampede. Within a couple of years, a bustling town had risen on the tundra, with law offices, real estate offices, drugstores, laundries, bathhouses, and stores. Nome was not the first town in the far north to have sprung into life from the prospects of finding gold. In the summer of 1896, prospectors had found gold near the Klondike River, just east of the Alaskan border in Canada's Yukon Territory. Despite the perils of northern travel, the Klondike and Nome stampedes transformed Alaska. The population nearly doubled between 1819 and 1900, and federal officials in Washington, D.C. quickly realized that the region was in need of a better communications system. Trails were cleared, and existing ones improved. New mining camps and towns went up as gold and other raw resources were discovered. Telegraph wires were erected so that the towns could communicate with each other and the states. From the beginning, Nome depended on its dogs. Teams were drafted into service as mail trucks, ambulances, freight trains, and long-distance taxis. It was not uncommon for a driver to have 25 dogs pulling 2 sleds with a 1,500-pound load. On the Alaskan Trail, the sled dogs became partners in a game of survival. Drivers depended on their dogs so that they could make a living, and relied on the animals' skill and intelligence to get them safely across the rough, dangerous terrain. With the coming of World War I, Nome settled into a quiet routine. But storms and the war led to an inflation that tripled the cost of mining, and many operations throughout Alaska went out of business. Thousands migrated south. Nome's population was reduced to 975 whites and 455 Eskimos or interracial residents. The glamour and excitement of the gold rush days were gone. Gold remained the principal industry in Nome, but now it was controlled by Hammond Consolidated Gold Fields, a conglomerate from the States. But from an Alaskan perspective, Nome was a smart and bustling outpost. Lula Welch, arriving with her husband Dr. Curtis Welch in 1919, felt an immediate charge of excitement. "It was so big and bright, I felt it must be New York City," she said. It was the first time in 12 years that the Welches had seen an electric light. They had landed in Alaska in 1907 and gone straight to the rough inland mining camp of Council. Welch worked with a portable operating table in a 3-bed ward about 20 feet long and lit by a kerosene lamp. If there happened to be a patient in the ward, he could watch the operation or turn over and look the other way, he wrote in a brief memoir. Nome felt like a luxurious new beginning for them. It had its own weekly newspaper, the Nome Nugget, bakeries, 2 restaurants, social halls, a library, a dressmaker, a U.S. Marshal's office, and a theater. Life was still hard, but the town relied on a spirit of cooperation and good citizenship. The trails were maintained in part by volunteers. Shopkeepers kept their stoves well stoked in case a traveler needed to warm up, and Dr. Welch treated his patients whether or not they could afford to pay. Welch remembered each year according to whom he treated and how they'd fared. Some years stood out. One summer there was an infection attributed to mosquitoes. Another year there was a number of injuries out at the mining camps, and no doctor could forget the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, when so many people had died. This year, ever since the Almeida sailed off, there had been one tonsillitis case after another. And on December the 24th, Welch had another sick child on his hands, a 7-year-old Eskimo girl named Margaret Ada, who had a severe sore throat and fever. Welch thought she might be suffering from follicular tonsillitis, but her mother, perhaps guided by her native superstition, wouldn't let him examine her. The child's father was away. Welch told the girl to stay in bed and rest, and afterwards he walked home through the town. For weeks, the shop windows along Front Street had been filled with skates and sleds, dolls and toys for Christmas. But it was unlikely that Welch was feeling much of a holiday spirit. It was not uncommon at this time of the year to be overcome by the sensation of isolation, and the cases of tonsillitis were nagging him. Other residents were in a jollier mood. At the Eagle Hall, which during the town's boom days had served as a venue for minstrel shows and boxing matches, the fireplace crackled, and stockings hung from the mantel, bulging with crackerjacks, candy canes, pencils, and fresh oranges and apples. The choir from the Eskimo church sang carols in their native tongue, and the other children reenacted the story of Christmas. Towards the end, they could hear the jingle of sleigh bells outside, and soon the heavy doors of the Eagle Hall swung open, and there was Fire Chief Yenny in his Santa suit, driving a sleigh pulled by two skittish reindeer, wearing red and green pom-poms and silver bells. After he had handed out the stockings, coffee and cake was served, and the whole town was alive and gossiping and carrying on. It was the start of the holidays. But over the next couple of days, Margaret Ada's condition deteriorated, and on December the 28th, Welch received notice that the young girl had died. Welch wanted to perform an autopsy, but again the mother refused to let him examine the body. The case bothered him. Death from tonsillitis is rare, but nevertheless sometimes does occur, he wrote. The following week there was more disturbing news. 2 other native children from Nome's permanent Eskimo population at Sandspit had reportedly died. Welch began to suspect the worst. Then on January the 20th, it all came to a head. As he was making his rounds at the Maynard Columbus Hospital, Welch checked in on a 3-year-old boy named Billy Barnett, whom he had admitted with a sore throat, swollen glands, fever, and fatigue. The boy now presented a disturbing new symptom: thick, greyish lesions in his throat and nasal membranes. Welch knew it was diphtheria. The grey and bloody ulcers on Billy's tonsils were characteristic of an ancient and dreaded bacteria, a centuries-old killer of young children, which for good reason was often referred to as the strangler. As the disease progressed and the ulcers expanded, they formed an almost leathery membrane made up of dead cells that eventually advanced down the windpipe, slowly suffocating the victim. It was a slow, painful, and frightening way to die. The potentially deadly consequence of not having a fresh supply of diphtheria antitoxin was now becoming all too clear. Diphtheria was a slow, painful, and frightening way to die. The majority of victims were children, and as one doctor described it, the anxious, struggling, pitiful expression of impending suffocation in child after child deeply affected physicians. Before the advent of antitoxin at the turn of the century, doctors could offer little comfort but their presence and prayers. Welch knew that the odds were stacked against him if he didn't find a fresh supply of serum. The disease was highly contagious. The bacteria were resilient and could survive for weeks on a piece of candy, a countertop, or a mitten. In every corner of Nome, bacteria could be lying in wait for the touch of a child. Every windowsill or schoolbook was a potential landing zone. And Welch realized that the disease could move quickly beyond the town's boundaries. Most northwestern Alaskans were Eskimo, and they had a paralyzing fear of disease, as a large portion of their population had been wiped out by the illnesses brought in by seafarers and miners. They believed in the spirit of death, and feared that if a person died in their home, that spirit would claim them next. A death often caused family members to panic and flee, and if this happened, the disease could spread down the coast. On the 21st of January, 1925, Welch was shaken from his troubled sleep before dawn. The daughter of Henry Stanley, an Eskimo on the Sandspit, was very sick and needed immediate attention. The Sandspit was a long, thin strip of beach that ended at the mouth of the Snake River, about 1.5 miles west of town. Most natives lived in single-room igloos made of driftwood, whalebone, sod, and scraps of tin. Some of the homes were still lit by seal oil lamps, and the air inside was thick with the smell of seal, dried salmon, sweat, and damp fur. 7-year-old Bessie Stanley lay in the back of the igloo, dark eyes peering out from a feverish, hollow-cheeked face, her chest heaving beneath an invisible weight. Welch hovered over the girl and pried open her mouth. The inside had become one mass of fetid, stinking membrane. By late evening, the girl would be dead, and there was now little doubt in Welch's mind that they were face to face with a catastrophic epidemic. When he got back to his apartment, he contacted the mayor, George Maynard, and told him to gather up the town council for a meeting. There was no time to lose. Early in the afternoon, Welch stood before the council and told them that all of Nome's children were at risk from diphtheria. He couldn't say for sure how Bessie Stanley and the others had contracted the disease, but it was clear to him that Nome now had an epidemic on its hands. The only treatment available for diphtheria was serum, he told them, and he only had enough for 6 patients at best. To make matters worse, those estimated 80,000 units were already 6 years old. To fight the epidemic properly, Welch said, he needed at least 1 million units. Every council member had vivid memories of Alaska's 1918 influenza epidemic, which had killed 50% of the native population of Nome. Without further prompting, they all agreed on a single course of action. Every school, church, movie house, and lodge were to be shut down, and travel along the trails would be strongly discouraged and banned outright for children. The meeting over, Welch made his way to the radio telegraph station to send out 2 urgent bulletins. One was to be coded for all points in Alaska and would alert every major town to Nome's desperate need for serum. The other would go to Washington, D.C., to Welch's colleagues at the U.S. Public Health Service. An epidemic of diphtheria is inevitable. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. Mail is only form of transportation. Stop. In less than a week, Nome's plight would make the front pages of nearly every newspaper in America. The quarantine began almost immediately, but despite their attempts to contain the disease, the council had acted too late. By the 4th day of the crisis, the death toll stood at 4, by conservative estimates, and still there was no word of any available serum from Fairbanks, Anchorage, or Juneau, or from Washington, D.C. The phone in Welch's office began to ring with one parent after another, calling in about a sick child. He was already feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, and the nearest doctor was a 10-day journey away, by dog sled. "My nurses are the only consultants I have," he noted. Emily Morgan was without doubt the most effective nurse in Welch's employ. She had had a long career in public nursing. For 3 years she had served with the Red Cross in a mobile hospital on the Western Front in France, working with the dying and wounded. Morgan was 47 when she arrived in Nome from Wichita, Kansas, the previous fall. She also had first-hand experience with diphtheria. She had been infected back in Wichita and spent 3 weeks in bed, and by the time she'd recovered, she knew every twist and turn of the disease's terrible progression. At Welch's suggestion, Morgan was appointed quarantine nurse, and she would go out to find and treat the most severe cases. She soon found herself putting up more and more of the red and black quarantine signs which hung over the doorways and stood out against the white snow. Morgan focused on the sandspit and checked in constantly on her patients and took care to see that the antitoxin was working, but often she found she could only offer her sympathy. Once, on her rounds, she returned to the home of an Eskimo family because she was particularly concerned about the condition of one of the 5 children, a young girl named Mary. As Morgan approached the igloo, a young Eskimo boy came running out. "You're too late," he told her. "Mary's gone to heaven." Inside, Morgan found the father hewing a coffin out of rough boards while the other children looked on. The nurse could do little to ease their grief, so she knelt beside the father and did all I could towards finishing the crude coffin. When they were done, the man lined it with his daughter's parka, placed her inside, nailed it shut, and buried her in a snowdrift. A proper burial would have to wait until spring, when the ground had thawed out.